My name is Professor Hiroshi Matsuda, and for 15 years I was one of Japan's most respected university professors, while simultaneously serving as the Yakuza's most effective recruitment officer, systematically identifying and corrupting the brightest minds in Japanese academia to serve the needs of organized crime. I wasn't just an educator who occasionally helped criminal organizations find talented individuals. I was the architect of a sophisticated pipeline that transformed Japan's most prestigious universities into breeding grounds for white-collar criminals, turning idealistic students into willing participants in money laundering, cybercrime, and international fraud operations. My position as a professor of economics at Waseda University gave me unprecedented access to the academic elite, allowing me to evaluate thousands of students each year and identify those with the intelligence, ambition, and psychological vulnerabilities that made them perfect candidates for criminal recruitment. The process was subtle and methodical, disguised as legitimate academic mentorship and career guidance that gradually introduced promising students to increasingly lucrative but morally questionable opportunities. It began in 2007, when Japan's economic stagnation had created a generation of highly educated young people facing limited career prospects despite their academic achievement. Traditional employment paths that had once guaranteed prosperity and social status were disappearing, leaving even the most brilliant students uncertain about their futures and vulnerable to alternative approaches to success. When a well-dressed businessman approached me after one of my lectures, claiming to represent a private consulting firm that specialized in identifying exceptional talent for exclusive career opportunities, I thought I was being offered a chance to help my students access high-paying positions in the legitimate business world. The reality was far more sinister and complex than I could have imagined. Within months, I found myself operating as a talent scout for criminal organizations, using my academic authority and trusted position to identify students who could be gradually corrupted and recruited into sophisticated criminal enterprises. The transition from legitimate professor to criminal recruiter happened so gradually that I barely noticed the moral boundaries dissolving until I was already trapped in a world where academic excellence became a tool for identifying future criminals and educational mentorship served as cover for systematic corruption of Japan's intellectual elite. My first recruitment target was a brilliant economics student named Yuki Tanaka, a 20-year-old from a working-class family who had earned a full scholarship to Waseda, but was struggling financially despite her academic success. She possessed exactly the combination of intellectual capability and economic desperation that made her an ideal candidate for the kind of alternative career path that my new associates were seeking to develop. The approach was sophisticated and patient. I began by offering her a paid research position in my department, ostensibly to help with legitimate academic projects, but actually to evaluate her psychological profile and test her willingness to bend rules for financial gain. Over several months, I gradually introduced increasingly questionable research methodologies, asking her to manipulate data in ways that weren't technically illegal but violated academic integrity standards. When she proved willing to compromise her principles for money, I knew she was ready for the next phase of recruitment. The criminal organization I was working with had developed a comprehensive understanding of how to exploit the vulnerabilities of Japan's educational system, recognizing that the intense pressure for academic achievement combined with limited economic opportunities created perfect conditions for corrupting even the most promising students. They understood that traditional criminal recruitment methods wouldn't work with university students, who were too intelligent and socially connected to be approached with crude offers of criminal employment. Instead, they needed a more sophisticated approach that gradually normalized unethical behavior while providing increasingly attractive financial incentives that made it difficult for students to refuse participation in criminal activities. My role was to identify students with the right combination of intelligence, ambition, and moral flexibility, then guide them through a carefully designed process that transformed them from idealistic academics into willing, participants in organized crime. The moment I truly understood what I had become involved in came during my 8th month of providing talent identification services, when I was asked to evaluate a computer science student named Akira Sato, who had developed innovative cybersecurity software as part of his thesis project. The criminal organization wasn't interested in his software for legitimate purposes. They wanted to recruit him to develop hacking tools and digital infiltration systems that could be used for large-scale financial crimes and corporate espionage. As I sat in my office reviewing Sato's academic records and psychological profile, preparing to manipulate this brilliant young man into a life of cybercrime, I realized that I wasn't just helping criminals find talented individuals, I was actively destroying the futures of Japan's most promising students, turning their intellectual gifts into weapons against the very society that had invested in their education. The systematic nature of the recruitment process was chilling in its efficiency and scope. The organization had identified specific academic disciplines that produced skills valuable for criminal enterprises: computer science students for cybercrime operations, economics majors for money laundering and financial fraud, engineering students for technical aspects of smuggling and counterfeiting, and psychology majors for manipulation and interrogation techniques. They had developed detailed profiles of the personality types most susceptible to criminal recruitment, focusing on students who displayed high intelligence combined with social isolation, financial stress, or resentment toward traditional authority structures. My job was to use my position as a trusted professor to identify these vulnerable individuals, then gradually introduce them to criminal contacts through a series of seemingly innocent academic and professional networking opportunities. The process typically took 6 to 12 months, beginning with legitimate-seeming research projects or internship opportunities that slowly introduced students to morally ambiguous activities before eventually revealing the true criminal nature of the work they were being recruited to perform. By the time students realized they were being recruited for criminal activities, they had already compromised themselves enough that backing out would result in academic scandal, financial ruin, or worse. The realization that I was no longer a voluntary participant but a captive asset of the criminal organization hit me when they revealed the extent of their surveillance and control over my personal and professional life. They had quietly investigated every aspect of my existence, from my financial obligations and family relationships to my academic reputation and career aspirations, creating a web of dependencies and vulnerabilities that made escape impossible without destroying everything I had worked to build. My elderly father required expensive medical care for his Parkinson's disease, and the organization had discreetly arranged to cover these costs through a series of untraceable payments that would be immediately discontinued if I attempted to withdraw from their recruitment operation. They had also compiled compromising evidence of my participation in their activities, including recorded conversations and documented instances of academic fraud that would end my career and result in criminal prosecution if revealed to university authorities. The sophistication of their control extended beyond simple blackmail to encompass a comprehensive understanding of academic politics and institutional vulnerabilities that allowed them to operate with virtual impunity within Japan's university system. They had cultivated relationships with corrupt administrators, compromised faculty members, and influential alumni who provided cover for their recruitment activities while ensuring that any potential whistleblowers would face immediate retaliation. The recruitment infrastructure they had established was a masterpiece of criminal organization, operating through a network of legitimate-seeming academic programs, research institutes, and professional development organizations that provided perfect cover for identifying and corrupting promising students. These front organizations offered real educational value and legitimate career opportunities, alongside their criminal recruitment functions, making it nearly impossible for students, parents, or university officials to distinguish between authentic academic programs and criminal operations. The most disturbing aspect was how they had weaponized the trust and authority inherent in the professor-student relationship, turning the mentorship that should have guided students toward productive careers into a tool for leading them into lives of crime. I found myself using techniques of psychological manipulation that I had learned in my academic study of behavioral economics, applying research on decision-making and risk assessment to identify the precise combination of incentives and pressures that would convince each individual student to compromise their values and join criminal enterprises. As my role within the organization evolved from simple talent identification to comprehensive recruitment coordination, I gained access to information that revealed the true scope of their infiltration into Japan's educational system and the systematic corruption that allowed criminal organizations to operate recruitment pipelines in dozens of universities across the country. The network I had joined wasn't limited to a single institution or criminal group, was part of a vast underground system that included hundreds of compromised faculty members, corrupt administrators, and criminal recruiters operating in every major university in Japan. Legitimate academic institutions had been systematically infiltrated and corrupted to serve the needs of organized crime, creating a shadow education system that paralleled official university programs while serving entirely different purposes. Research grants were diverted to fund criminal operations, academic conferences became recruitment events, and student exchange programs were used to facilitate international criminal activity. The corruption extended to academic publishing, where fraudulent research was used to legitimize criminal methodologies, and to professional licensing boards that had been compromised to ensure that criminally recruited graduates could obtain legitimate credentials. My position gave me insight into the organization's broader activities and the role that university recruitment played in enabling everything from international money laundering to sophisticated fraud schemes that targeted governments and corporations around the world. The students we recruited weren't just being prepared for traditional criminal activities, they were being trained to infiltrate legitimate institutions and use their academic credentials to facilitate criminal operations from within respected organizations. Some became corrupt bankers who facilitated money laundering. Others became government officials who provided inside information about regulatory enforcement, and still others became corporate executives who used their positions to enable fraud and embezzlement. The most disturbing aspect was how the organization used academic research to develop new criminal methodologies, funding legitimate-seeming studies that actually served to refine techniques for financial fraud, cybercrime, and psychological manipulation. I found myself supervising graduate students whose thesis research was secretly being used to develop more effective methods of criminal recruitment, more sophisticated approaches to money laundering, and more advanced techniques for evading law enforcement detection. The psychological toll of living a double life as both educator and corrupter of youth began to manifest in ways that threatened my ability to function as a professor and as a human being, forcing me to confront the fundamental contradiction between my academic mission and my criminal complicity. During the day, I maintained my position as a respected economics professor, teaching legitimate courses and conducting authentic research while genuinely caring about the educational development of the majority of my students who were not targets for criminal recruitment. But every evening I descended into a world of systematic corruption where I used the same knowledge and authority to identify and manipulate vulnerable young people into lives of crime. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. I would spend my morning lecturing about ethical business practices and economic justice, then spend my afternoon developing psychological profiles of students who could be recruited for financial crimes. I began experiencing severe insomnia, anxiety attacks, and episodes of dissociation where I felt disconnected from my own actions, as if I were watching someone else destroy the lives of promising young people while I observed helplessly from outside my own body. The stress manifested in physical symptoms that I recognized as classic signs of moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when someone is forced to act against their deepest values and beliefs. I started making mistakes in my legitimate academic work, missing obvious errors in student papers and struggling to maintain the intellectual rigor that had once defined my scholarly reputation. My colleagues began to notice changes in my behavior, commenting on my increased irritability, social withdrawal, and apparent burnout that seemed disproportionate to the normal stresses of academic life. The worst part was the growing realization that I was becoming desensitized to the destruction I was causing, that the systematic corruption of bright young minds was starting to seem routine rather than horrifying. I found myself evaluating potential recruitment targets with the same clinical detachment I would use for any other academic assessment, focusing on their psychological vulnerabilities and criminal potential while mentally blocking out the human cost of turning them into criminals. This emotional numbing was perhaps the most frightening development of all, because it represented the death of the compassionate educator I had once been and the birth of something cold and calculating that I barely recognized as myself. The turning point in my relationship with the organization came when I was ordered to participate directly in the recruitment of Mei Chen, a brilliant computer science student whose innovative work on artificial intelligence had attracted international attention and made her a high-priority target for criminal recruitment. Debt, unlike my previous assignments, which had involved gradually corrupting students over months of careful manipulation. This case required me to accelerate the timeline and use more aggressive psychological pressure to secure her cooperation before competing criminal organizations or legitimate employers could recruit her. The session took place in a private meeting room that had been equipped with recording equipment to document her responses and psychological reactions, allowing the organization to develop a comprehensive profile that would be used to design a customized recruitment strategy. My role was to conduct what appeared to be a routine academic advising session while actually implementing sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques designed to identify her deepest fears, strongest motivations, and most exploitable vulnerability. The techniques they had taught me were based on legitimate psychological research but applied for criminal purposes. Carefully calibrated questions that revealed personal insecurities, strategic displays of authority and knowledge that established psychological dominance, and subtle threats disguised as academic guidance that made her understand the consequences of refusing their offers. As I sat across from this brilliant young woman, using my position as her trusted professor to probe for psychological weaknesses that could be exploited by criminal recruiters, I realized that I had crossed a line from which there could be no return. I was no longer just identifying potential recruits. I was actively participating in their psychological manipulation, using my academic expertise to perfect techniques of human exploitation that would destroy their futures and turn their talents against society. The information I gathered during that session would be used to design a recruitment approach that would gradually corrupt her research, compromise her academic integrity, and ultimately transform her from a promising AI researcher into a developer of criminal hacking tools and surveillance systems. My academic knowledge had become a weapon against the very students I had sworn to educate and protect, and the trust they placed in me as their professor was being systematically betrayed for the benefit of criminal organizations. The decision to begin secretly documenting the organization's recruitment operations was born from a desperate need to find some way to atone for my complicity in destroying the futures of countless promising students while still trapped within a system that made direct resistance impossible. I knew that any attempt to simply walk away or report their activities to authorities would result in my professional destruction and potentially physical harm to my family. But I also knew that I couldn't continue to participate in the systematic corruption of Japan's educational system without taking some action to eventually expose and stop their operations. I began by making copies of recruitment files that documented the systematic targeting of vulnerable students, photographing psychological profiles that revealed the sophisticated manipulation techniques being used, and recording conversations that provided evidence of the organization's infiltration into multiple universities. The process required extreme caution and patience. I could only access small amounts of information at a time, had to vary my documentation methods to avoid detection, and needed to find secure ways to store evidence without leaving digital traces that could be discovered during security sweeps. Over the course of 2 years, I assembled a comprehensive archive that included recruitment records for hundreds of students, psychological manipulation protocols, evidence of academic fraud and corruption, and recorded conversations that implicated dozens of faculty members and administrators in criminal activity. The archive grew to include detailed documentation of the organization's recruitment infrastructure, lists of compromised educational institutions, evidence of research fraud and academic corruption, and proof of the systematic use of educational resources to facilitate criminal enterprises. But collecting evidence was only the first step. I also needed to find a way to use it effectively while protecting myself and my family from retaliation. I couldn't simply turn the information over to Japanese law enforcement, knowing that the organization had cultivated relationships with corrupt officials who might warn them about any investigation. Instead, I began reaching out to international education organizations, academic integrity boards, and investigative journalists who had the resources and independence necessary to act on the information I had gathered. The challenge was establishing contact with these organizations without alerting the criminal network to my activities, requiring me to use encrypted communications, anonymous email accounts, and carefully planned meetings in public locations where surveillance would be difficult. The complexity of planning my escape from the criminal recruitment network required the same meticulous attention to detail that I applied to academic research, but with the added challenge of operating under constant surveillance while maintaining the appearance of absolute loyalty to the organization. I knew that any sudden change in my behavior or routine would trigger suspicion, so I had to gradually implement my exit strategy over several years while continuing to provide recruitment services with the same efficiency and dedication that had made me valuable to them. The first step was establishing secure communication channels with potential allies outside Japan who could help me when the time came to defect. I made contact with professors at international universities, education policy researchers at global organizations, and academic integrity experts who specialized in exposing corruption in higher education systems. These initial communications served multiple purposes. They verified the authenticity and value of the evidence I had collected, established my credibility as a potential whistleblower, and began the process of negotiating the terms of my eventual defection and the protection that would be necessary for both myself and my family. The international education community was extremely interested in what I had to offer. The systematic corruption of university systems by organized crime was a global problem that extended far beyond Japan's borders, and my documentation provided unprecedented insight into how criminal organizations exploit educational institutions for recruitment and operational purposes. While these negotiations continued in secret, I also began the delicate process of extracting myself from the most sensitive aspects of my recruitment work without arousing suspicion. I gradually delegated responsibilities to other compromised faculty members, claiming that I wanted to focus on developing new recruitment methodologies and training programs rather than day-to-day student evaluation. I started taking more frequent trips to academic conferences and research collaborations, ostensibly to stay current with developments in behavioral economics and educational psychology, but actually to meet with my international contacts and establish safe houses in countries where I might need to seek refuge. The most challenging aspect was maintaining my recruitment quotas, while secretly working to undermine the very system I was supposed to be strengthening, requiring me to identify students who appeared suitable for recruitment but were actually too psychologically stable or morally grounded to be successfully corrupted. The final phase of my escape plan was accelerated by an unexpected development that forced me to choose between my own safety and the future of a brilliant student named Rika Yamamoto, who had become the organization's highest priority recruitment target. In early 2022, I was ordered to oversee her recruitment personally, using the most aggressive psychological manipulation techniques in the organization's arsenal to ensure her cooperation in developing AI systems that would be used for large-scale financial fraud and government surveillance. Here, the student was a 21-year-old computer science prodigy who had developed revolutionary machine learning algorithms that could predict and manipulate human behavior with unprecedented accuracy, making her research invaluable for criminal applications. The organization's leadership was planning to use her work to create sophisticated fraud detection evasion systems, develop more effective psychological manipulation tools, and build surveillance networks that could infiltrate government and corporate computer systems. As I reviewed the recruitment plan that would systematically destroy this young woman's integrity and turn her brilliant mind into a weapon against society, I realized that I had reached a point where my complicity in the organization's crimes had become intolerable. I could no longer rationalize my participation by telling myself that I was just identifying potential recruits or that my family's safety justified my continued cooperation. This student's corruption would represent a quantum leap in the organization's criminal capability, and her brilliant research would enable crimes that could affect millions of people around the world. That night, I made the decision to accelerate my escape timeline and take action that would expose the organization's recruitment network, even if it meant sacrificing my own safety and potentially my family's security. I contacted my international allies and informed them that I was ready to defect immediately, providing them with detailed information about the organization's recruitment infrastructure and the locations of their primary operational center. I also made arrangements to ensure that Yamamoto would be warned about the recruitment attempt and provided with protection from criminal retaliation, even if it meant revealing my role in the organization's operations. The extraction plan called for me to disappear during a routine academic conference, where I would be taken into protective custody by international law enforcement agents before being relocated to a secure facility where I could provide detailed testimony about everything I had witnessed and participated in during my years as a criminal recruiter in Japan's university system. The morning of my escape, March 25, 2020, began with a routine faculty meeting where I was scheduled to present my latest recruitment analysis to other compromised professors, unaware that this would be the last time I would use my academic expertise to facilitate the corruption of Japan's educational system. As I sat in the conference room reviewing psychological profiles of potential recruitment targets, carefully analyzing their vulnerabilities and criminal potential while my colleagues discussed strategies for expanding their operations into new universities, I was acutely aware that hidden in my briefcase were encrypted drives containing evidence that would destroy the recruitment network I had served for so long. The meeting was a masterclass in academic corruption, respected professors discussing the systematic manipulation of vulnerable students with the same clinical detachment they would use for any other research project. They analyzed the recruitment success rates, evaluated the effectiveness of different psychological manipulation techniques, and planned the expansion of their operations into international universities where they could recruit foreign students for global criminal enterprises. As I listened to my colleagues casually discussing the destruction of young lives as if it were a legitimate academic endeavor, I felt a mixture of professional disgust at the perversion of educational values and moral determination to ensure that their crimes would finally be exposed. After completing the meeting, I returned to my office to gather the materials I would need for what was supposedly a routine trip to attend an economics conference in Seoul. The organization had no reason to suspect that this trip was anything other than a normal academic obligation. I had attended similar conferences dozens of times over the years, and my role in maintaining international academic relationships was well established and trusted. As I packed my briefcase with the encrypted drives containing evidence of their recruitment operation, I felt the weight of 15 years of complicity pressing down on me like a physical burden. The files contained recruitment records that documented systematic student manipulation, psychological profiles that proved human rights violations, and financial documents that revealed the scope of their criminal educational empire. Hidden among legitimate academic papers were the tools that would finally allow me to honor the educational mission I had violated so many times, to use my knowledge to protect rather than corrupt students, and to ensure that the damage I had enabled would finally serve a purpose in bringing justice to the victims. The extraction itself unfolded flawlessly, a testament to months of careful planning and coordination between international law enforcement agencies, education organizations, and academic integrity boards who understood the global significance of the evidence I was providing about the systematic corruption of university systems by organized crime. I boarded the flight to Seoul without incident, maintaining the casual demeanor of a professor traveling for routine academic business while internally counting down the minutes until I would be safely in protective custody. The 3-hour flight felt like an eternity, every moment bringing the possibility that my absence had been discovered and that criminal agents might be waiting for me at Incheon Airport. But when I arrived and made my way through the crowded terminal, the predetermined signal from my international contact, a woman reading a specific academic journal in the airport cafe, confirmed that everything was proceeding according to plan. Within minutes, I was whisked away to a secure facility where I began the process of formally defecting from the criminal organization that had corrupted my academic career and turned me into an instrument of educational destruction. The debriefing sessions that followed were exhaustive and emotionally devastating, as I spent weeks walking international investigators through every aspect of the recruitment network I had helped to build and maintain. The scope of their interest went far beyond simple documentation of student manipulation and academic corruption. My evidence revealed connections to international criminal organizations, sophisticated fraud networks, and educational corruption schemes that operated across multiple countries and continents. The thousands of recruitment records I had collected over 2 years provided law enforcement with an unprecedented window into how organized crime exploits educational institutions, showing how criminal proceeds flow through legitimate academic channels and how corrupt networks use educational resources to enhance their criminal capabilities. As I testified about student after student, recruitment after recruitment, I was forced to confront the full magnitude of what I had been part of for over 15 years. The numbers were staggering: hundreds of students corrupted and recruited into criminal enterprises, dozens of universities infiltrated and compromised, thousands of academic resources diverted to criminal purposes, and an entire shadow education system that operated completely outside legal oversight or ethical constraints. Each case I described represented a young life that had been systematically destroyed, a brilliant mind that had been turned against society, and a future that had been stolen for the benefit of criminal organizations. The coordinated international raids that followed my defection struck simultaneously at criminal recruitment operations in 12 countries, exposing a global network of corrupted educational institutions and compromised faculty members that had operated in shadows for decades. I watched the news coverage from my secure location, seeing familiar faces being led away in handcuffs and recognizing universities where I had spent countless hours identifying and corrupting promising students. The raids were timed to prevent the organization from destroying evidence or relocating their operations, with law enforcement agencies in Japan, South Korea, China, Thailand, Philippines, Australia, United States, and 5 European countries executing search warrants at exactly the same moment to maximize the element of surprise. The evidence I had provided proved to be even more valuable than investigators had hoped. My detailed documentation of recruitment procedures and student profiles allowed them to trace criminal activities across multiple jurisdictions, revealing the true extent of organized crimes, infiltration into international education systems. Within 72 hours, over 200 arrests had been made, including several high-ranking members of the Criminal Recruitment Division and dozens of corrupt faculty members who had facilitated their operations in legitimate universities. The educational impact was devastating for the organization. Not only were their recruitment capabilities severely compromised, but their ability to conduct future operations was hampered by the loss of academic professionals who possessed critical knowledge about identifying and manipulating vulnerable students. The raids also uncovered evidence of systematic academic fraud that would lead to international criminal charges, including documentation of research manipulation, evidence of degree mill operations, and proof of the use of educational credentials to facilitate criminal enterprises. But I also knew that the organization's response would be swift and merciless, and that my betrayal had made me the primary target of their revenge. Intelligence reports confirmed that they had placed a substantial bounty on my head and were using their remaining resources to locate me. Despite the extensive security measures that had been put in place to protect my identity and location, the psychological pressure of living under constant threat was immense, but it was offset by the satisfaction of knowing that my decision to come forward had struck a devastating blow against a criminal network that had corrupted one of society's most trusted institutions. The legal proceedings that followed the raids stretched over 3 years, during which I served as the prosecution's primary witness in multiple jurisdictions, testifying in courtrooms from Tokyo to Geneva about the systematic corruption of educational systems and the use of academic institutions to facilitate some of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in modern organized crime history. Each trial was a grueling experience that required me to relive my years as a criminal recruiter while facing cross-examination from defense attorneys who were determined to discredit my testimony and portray me as an unreliable witness seeking to save himself by fabricating evidence against former colleagues. The psychological toll was enormous. I was forced to confront my own complicity in destroying the futures of countless students, while simultaneously serving as the instrument of justice that would bring the perpetrators to account for their actions. The defense teams employed every possible strategy to undermine my credibility, arguing that I was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, a pathological liar who had fabricated evidence for personal gain, or a master manipulator who had orchestrated the entire criminal recruitment enterprise, and was now attempting to shift blame to innocent victims. But the documentary evidence I had collected was overwhelming and irrefutable. Thousands of recruitment records, psychological profiles, and financial documents that painted a complete picture of how the organization operated and left no room for doubt about the guilt of the defendants. The recruitment records alone told a story of systematic corruption that shocked even experienced prosecutors and judges, detailed documentation of student manipulation sessions, evidence of psychological abuse conducted under the guise of academic mentorship, and proof of the deliberate use of educational authority to destroy young lives for criminal profit, one by one. The trials resulted in convictions that would effectively dismantle the criminal recruitment infrastructure and send its leadership to prison for decades. The sentences were severe life imprisonment for the top recruitment coordinators, 22 35-year terms for professors who had participated in student corruption, and substantial prison time even for administrators and staff who had played supporting roles in the organization's educational operations. The financial penalties were equally devastating, with courts ordering the forfeiture of millions of dollars in assets and imposing fines that would prevent the organization from rebuilding its recruitment capabilities, even if its members were eventually released from prison. The personal cost of my decision to expose the criminal recruitment network has been enormous and ongoing, requiring me to live under an assumed identity in a foreign country where I have no family, no friends from my previous life, and no connection to the academic community that once defined my professional identity. The Witness Protection Program provided me with excellent security and a comfortable standard of living, but it couldn't replace the sense of purpose and intellectual fulfillment that I had derived from legitimate academic work, even in its corrupted form. I was given a new name, a fabricated personal history, and extensive training in how to maintain my cover identity, but I could never escape the knowledge that my real life as an educator had ended. The moment I walked away from that faculty meeting and boarded the plane to Seoul, The psychological adjustment was far more difficult than I had anticipated. I found myself grieving not just for the life I had lost, but for the professor I had been before I became entangled in the criminal world. The young academic who had graduated with dreams of educating and inspiring students seemed like a stranger to me now. Someone whose idealism and dedication had been systematically destroyed by years of moral compromise and criminal complicity. I struggled with depression, anxiety, and a profound sense of guilt that no amount of cooperation with law enforcement could fully alleviate. Yes, I had helped to expose and dismantle one of the world's most sophisticated criminal recruitment networks. But I had also been complicit in their crimes for over 15 years, and the damage they had caused during that time was irreversible. The students I had identified and corrupted, the young minds I had turned toward criminal enterprises, the futures I had destroyed in service of organized crime, their suffering was real and permanent. And my eventual cooperation with authorities couldn't undo the harm I had helped to cause. I began working with therapists who specialized in helping former criminals adjust to legitimate life. But the process of rebuilding my moral foundation and learning to live with my past was slow and painful. The most challenging aspect was accepting that I would never be able to work in education again, that the profession I had loved and dedicated my life to was forever closed to me because of the choices I had made. 4 years after my escape from the criminal recruitment network, I have built a new life that focuses on using my knowledge to combat the very crimes I once facilitated. Working as a consultant for international education, organizations, and academic integrity, boards that are struggling to identify and prevent the corruption of educational systems by criminal organizations. The irony is not lost on my I am now paid to design systems that would have detected and prevented the recruitment crimes I once committed, using my intimate knowledge of criminal educational methods to help legitimate organizations protect themselves from the kind of corruption I once specialized in. My work involves training university administrators to recognize signs of criminal infiltration, helping regulatory agencies understand how organized crime exploits educational systems, and assisting prosecutors in complex cases where my experience provides crucial insights into criminal recruitment methodologies. The transition from criminal enabler to crime fighter has been professionally rewarding but emotionally complex, as I am constantly reminded of my past while working to prevent others from following the same destructive path. I have become something of an expert on the psychology of academic corruption, understanding from personal experience how intelligent, dedicated educators can gradually become complicit in criminal activities through a series of small compromises that seem individually justifiable but collectively lead to moral catastrophe. This insight has proven valuable in developing prevention programs that target the recruitment methods used by criminal organizations to corrupt educational professionals. I work with universities to educate faculty about the ethical challenges they may face and the warning signs of criminal recruitment, help professional education associations develop guidelines that make it harder for criminals to exploit their members, and assist law enforcement agencies in understanding how to approach potential cooperating witnesses who may be trapped in criminal organizations against their better judgment. To work is meaningful and important, but it also serves as a constant reminder of the choices I made and the harm I caused during my years as a criminal recruiter. Every case I work on, every corruption scheme I help to uncover, every criminal I help to prosecute brings back memories of my own complicity in similar activities and forces me to confront the lasting consequences of my moral failures. The most challenging aspect of my new life has been learning to form genuine relationships with people who know nothing about my criminal past, while constantly managing the fear that my true identity might be discovered and put both myself and anyone close to me in danger. The criminal recruitment network may have been severely damaged by the prosecutions that followed my defection, but organized crime groups have long memories and substantial resources for revenge. And I know that there are still people searching for me who would not hesitate to kill me if they discovered my location. This knowledge affects every aspect of my daily life. Avoid social media, change my routines regularly, and maintain a level of vigilance that makes spontaneous friendships and romantic relationships extremely difficult. I have learned to live with loneliness as a necessary price for safety, but the isolation is sometimes overwhelming, especially during holidays and special occasions when I am reminded of the family and professional connections I can never reclaim. See, the Witness Protection Program provides excellent security, but it cannot provide the human warmth and belonging that are essential for psychological well-being. I have attempted to build new relationships based on my assumed identity, but the constant need to maintain my cover story creates a barrier to genuine intimacy that is difficult to overcome. Okay. How do you explain to someone you care about why you have no photographs from your university years, no former colleagues to reminisce with, no family members to visit during holidays? The lies necessary to maintain my cover become increasingly complex and emotionally exhausting, and I sometimes wonder if the isolation is worse than the physical danger I escaped. But then I remember the students whose futures I helped to destroy, the brilliant young minds I corrupted, the promising careers I derailed, the lives I damaged in service of criminal organizations, and I remind myself that my discomfort is a small price to pay for the justice that was finally served and the future crimes that were prevented by my cooperation. Sigh. I have found some solace in volunteer work with organizations that help at-risk students and combat educational fraud, though I can never reveal the personal experience that drives my commitment to their cause. Fourth, the global impact of the evidence I provided has extended far beyond the prosecution of the criminal recruitment network, leading to fundamental changes in how international law enforcement agencies approach education-related crimes and how academic institutions implement safeguards against criminal infiltration. The detailed documentation I collected revealed patterns and methodologies that were previously unknown to investigators, showing how criminal organizations exploit specific vulnerabilities in educational systems and how they adapt their operations to evade detection by traditional oversight mechanisms. This intelligence has been used to develop new investigative techniques, improve international cooperation protocols, and create more effective regulatory frameworks that make it harder for criminals to corrupt educational professionals and institutions. University accreditation boards and regulatory agencies around the world have implemented new reporting requirements and monitoring systems based on the insights gained from my case, and several countries have strengthened their laws governing educational institutions to close the loopholes that criminal organizations had been exploiting for decades. The ripple effects continue to be felt throughout the criminal underworld, as other organizations have been forced to modify their operations in response to the new security measures and investigative capabilities that emerged from the recruitment network prosecutions. Intelligence reports suggest that my defection has made criminal organizations more paranoid about insider threats within their educational operations, leading them to implement more stringent security measures that actually make their operations less efficient and more vulnerable to detection. The psychological impact on criminal leadership has been significant. Someone as trusted and valuable as I was could turn against the organization. Then no educational professional could be considered completely reliable, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that undermines the cooperation these groups depend on for their survival. This paranoia has led to internal conflicts and power struggles within several major criminal organizations, as leaders become increasingly suspicious of their academic recruits and begin eliminating potential threats in ways that often damage their own operational capability. The long-term effect has been to make organized crime less organized and more vulnerable to law enforcement infiltration and disruption, while also making it more difficult for criminal groups to maintain the sophisticated educational infrastructure necessary for complex recruitment operations. Perhaps the most unexpected consequence of my decision to expose the criminal recruitment network has been the opportunity to help other educational professionals who find themselves trapped in similar situations and are looking for a way out without destroying their careers or endangering their families. Through my work with international organizations, I have been contacted by dozens of professors, administrators, and other education professionals in situations similar to my own educators who were recruited by criminal organizations for their legitimate skills but gradually became complicit in illegal activities and now want to escape without facing criminal prosecution or retaliation. These individuals come from all over the world, professors in developing countries who were forced to participate in degree mill operations, administrators in prestigious universities who were coerced into facilitating money laundering through research grants, teachers in international schools who discovered that their institutions were being used for human trafficking, and researchers who found that their work was being used to develop criminal technologies or manipulation techniques. Each case is unique, but they all share common elements: intelligent, dedicated educators who made compromises they thought they could control, who gradually became more deeply involved in criminal activities than they ever intended, and who now face the terrifying choice between continued complicity and the enormous risks associated with cooperation with law enforcement. I have become an informal counselor and advisor for these potential defectors, helping them understand their options, evaluate the risks and benefits of cooperation, and develop strategies for safely extracting themselves from criminal organizations while providing valuable intelligence to authority. The work is deeply personal for me, as I see reflections of my own journey in their stories and understand the psychological and practical challenges they face in ways that traditional law enforcement officers cannot. I help them navigate the complex process of becoming cooperating witnesses, prepare for the emotional trauma of betraying former colleagues, and adjust to the reality of life in witness protection or under assumed identities. Still, many of these individuals have provided crucial intelligence that has led to additional prosecutions and the disruption of criminal networks around the world, creating a cascading effect where each successful defection makes it easier for others to come forward and contributes to the gradual erosion of organized crime's ability to corrupt educational systems. The educational crime landscape has evolved significantly since my defection, with criminal organizations adapting their methods to address the vulnerabilities that my case exposed, while law enforcement agencies have developed new capabilities to detect and prevent the corruption of academic systems. The cat-and-mouse game between criminals and authorities has intensified, with both sides employing increasingly sophisticated technologies and methodologies in their ongoing battle for advantage. Online education and digital learning platforms have emerged as major new frontiers in this conflict, with criminal organizations embracing remote learning technologies as a way to recruit students without the physical infrastructure that my evidence helped authorities to identify and raid. However, law enforcement agencies have also developed new capabilities for tracking digital educational communication, and the electronic records that criminals thought would provide anonymity have actually created permanent audit trails that can be analyzed using advanced data analytics and artificial intelligence. The result has been a series of major prosecutions targeting criminal online education networks that demonstrated that digital learning is not the safe haven for criminal recruitment operations that many organizations had hoped it would be. Meanwhile, traditional criminal recruitment operations have become more compartmentalized and security-conscious, with criminal organizations implementing cellular structures that limit the amount of information any single educational professional can access. A direct response to the comprehensive intelligence that my defection provided to authority. Sure. These new security measures make criminal recruitment networks more resilient to individual defections, but they also make their operations less efficient and more vulnerable to systematic law enforcement infiltration. The overall trend has been toward smaller, more specialized criminal recruitment operations that focus on specific types of students or academic disciplines rather than the large, comprehensive networks like the one I was part of that dominated the landscape when I was active. This fragmentation has made it more difficult for any single criminal group to achieve the kind of systematic influence over educational systems that the Yakuza once wielded. But it has also created new challenges for law enforcement agencies that must now track and investigate dozens of smaller networks rather than focusing on a few major organizations. The psychological journey of rebuilding my identity and moral foundation after over 15 years as a criminal recruiter has been far more complex and ongoing than I anticipated when I first decided to cooperate with law enforcement. The process of confronting my own complicity in destroying the futures of countless students while simultaneously working to combat similar activities has required me to develop a nuanced understanding of guilt, responsibility, and redemption that goes far beyond simple legal concepts of right and wrong. I have had to learn to live with the knowledge that I cannot undo the harm I helped to cause, while finding ways to channel my expertise and experience into activities that serve the greater good and help prevent future victims from suffering similar damage. This psychological balancing act is exhausting and sometimes overwhelming, but it has also led to insights about human nature and moral decision-making that have proven valuable in my work with other potential defectors and in my contributions to law enforcement training programs. I have come to understand that most people who become involved in criminal recruitment activities are not inherently evil, but rather individuals who make a series of small compromises that gradually erode their moral boundaries until they find themselves complicit in activities they would have found abhorrent in their earlier careers. This understanding has made me more effective at identifying potential cooperating witnesses and helping them navigate the complex process of extracting themselves from criminal organizations. It has also informed my work on prevention programs that target the recruitment methods used by criminal organizations to corrupt educational professionals. The key insight is that criminal recruitment is often a gradual process that exploits normal human desires for financial security, professional advancement, and social belonging, rather than a dramatic moment of moral choice between good and evil. By understanding these psychological mechanisms, we can develop more effective strategies for identifying and interrupting the recruitment process before educational professionals become so deeply involved that cooperation with law enforcement becomes their only viable option for escape. This work has given my life a sense of purpose and meaning that helps to offset the loneliness and isolation of my protected existence, providing a way to transform my criminal experience into something that serves the cause of justice and education. The technological revolution in education has created both new opportunities and new challenges for combating educational crimes, requiring constant adaptation of the methods and systems that I helped to develop based on my experience with traditional criminal recruitment operations. Artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms have dramatically improved the ability of regulatory agencies to detect suspicious patterns in academic behavior. But criminal organizations have also begun using similar technologies to optimize their recruitment operations and evade detection. The result is an escalating technological arms race where both sides are constantly developing new capabilities and countermeasures in response to their opponents' innovations. Online learning platforms and digital academic communications have fundamentally altered the landscape of educational crime, creating new possibilities for both criminal exploitation and law enforcement investigation. While criminals initially embraced digital education technologies as a way to recruit students without the physical infrastructure that could be raided by authority, the permanent and traceable nature of digital records has actually made it easier for investigators to track criminal recruitment activities once they understand how to analyze these new types of data. My work now involves helping law enforcement agencies develop the technical capabilities and analytical frameworks needed to investigate digital educational crimes, while also assisting academic institutions in implementing compliance systems that can detect suspicious digital recruitment activities. The challenge is that these new technologies evolve so rapidly that training and regulatory frameworks struggle to keep pace, creating temporary windows of vulnerability that criminal organizations are quick to exploit. This dynamic environment requires constant learning and adaptation, both for the criminals trying to stay ahead of law enforcement and for the investigators working to detect and prevent their activity. The most successful approaches combine traditional investigative methods with cutting-edge technology, using human intelligence and relationship analysis to understand criminal networks while employing advanced data analytics to track their recruitment activities across multiple platforms and jurisdictions. The goal is to create integrated systems that can identify potential criminal recruitment activities quickly and accurately, while still allowing legitimate educational providers to operate efficiently without unnecessary regulatory burdens or compliance costs. 15 years after my escape from the criminal recruitment network, I can see the long-term impact of my decision to cooperate with law enforcement, not just in terms of the specific prosecutions and institutional reforms that resulted from my testimony, but in the broader changes to how educational systems protect themselves against criminal infiltration and how society responds to academic corruption. The comprehensive intelligence I provided has been used to develop new theoretical frameworks for understanding the corruption of educational institutions as a form of institutional capture that undermines public trust in academic systems and threatens the fundamental principles of educational integrity. This academic research has informed policy discussions about how to strengthen educational governance and reduce the social conditions that make educational professionals vulnerable to criminal recruitment and coercion. The evidence I collected has also been used in international forums to advocate for stronger cooperation between educational regulatory agencies and more consistent ethical standards that make it harder for criminal organizations to exploit differences in academic regulations and oversight mechanisms between different countries. Several international education agreements and protocols have been strengthened or created based on lessons learned from the recruitment network case, improving the global education community's ability to combat criminal infiltration of academic systems. But perhaps the most important long-term impact has been the demonstration that even the most sophisticated and well-protected criminal recruitment networks are vulnerable to exposure and prosecution when insiders are willing to come forward with evidence of their activity. This precedent has encouraged other potential academic whistleblowers to contact law enforcement agencies, leading to a cascade of additional cases that have significantly weakened organized crime's influence over educational institutions. The psychological impact on criminal leadership has been profound. Knowledge that trusted educational professionals might be documenting their activities and planning to defect has made criminal organizations more paranoid and less efficient in their recruitment operations. While the success of witness protection programs has reduced the deterrent effect of threats and intimidation, the overall result has been a measurable decline in the power and influence of traditional organized crime groups over educational systems, though this has sometimes been offset by the emergence of new types of criminal networks that are more decentralized and harder to infiltrate. The personal cost of my transformation from criminal recruiter to law enforcement asset has been enormous, but it has also provided me with a unique perspective on the nature of justice, redemption, and the possibility of positive change even in the darkest circumstances. I have learned that true accountability requires not just punishment for past crimes, but active efforts to prevent future harm and to help repair the damage that criminal activities have caused to individuals and communities. This understanding has shaped my approach to the work I do now, focusing not just on helping to prosecute criminals, but on developing systems and programs that address the root causes of educational corruption and provide alternatives for educational professionals who might otherwise be drawn into illegal activity. I work with universities to develop curricula that help future educators understand the ethical dimensions of their profession and recognize the warning signs of criminal recruitment, assist professional education associations in creating support networks for educators who are trying to escape from criminal organizations or rebuild their careers after serving prison sentences for educational crimes, and help develop training programs for law enforcement officers who specialize in investigating education-related crimes. Most importantly, I try to use my story as an example of how people can change direction even after making terrible choices, demonstrating that redemption is possible for those who are willing to accept responsibility for their actions and work to make amends for the harm they have caused. This message is particularly important for young educational professionals who may be facing the same kinds of pressures and temptations I confronted as a young professor: the pressure to prioritize financial gain over student welfare, the temptation to compromise ethical standards for personal advancement, and the gradual erosion of moral boundaries that can lead even well-intentioned educators into criminal complicity. My experience shows that the apparent benefits of criminal involvement are ultimately illusory, while the costs, both personal and professional, are real and lasting. But it also shows that it is never too late to choose a different path, even for someone who has been deeply involved in criminal activities for many years. The key is having the courage to acknowledge past mistakes, accept the risks associated with change, and commit to using whatever skills and knowledge you have acquired in service of legitimate education rather than criminal enterprises. The evolution of my relationship with my own past has been one of the most challenging aspects of building a new life after escaping from the criminal recruitment network. For many years, I struggled with shame and self-hatred over my role in destroying the futures of countless students, unable to reconcile the person I had become with the values I thought I held and the educational mission I had originally planned to pursue in academia. The weight of knowing that my expertise had enabled the corruption of brilliant young minds, the systematic destruction of promising careers, and the perversion of educational institutions was crushing. And I often wondered whether my eventual cooperation with law enforcement was motivated by genuine remorse or simply by self-preservation and the desire to escape the consequences of my choices. Working with therapists who specialized in helping former criminals adjust to legitimate life, I gradually learned to develop a more nuanced understanding of guilt and responsibility that allowed me to acknowledge my complicity in harmful activities while also recognizing my capacity for positive change and moral growth. This process required me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own character and motivations, including the recognition that my initial involvement with the criminal organization had been driven not just by financial pressure but also by professional pride, intellectual curiosity, and the desire to be part of something powerful and exclusive. Understanding these psychological factors was essential for preventing myself from making similar choices in the future and for helping other potential defectors recognize and address their own motivations for criminal involvement. I learned that true redemption requires not just changing your behavior, but understanding why you made harmful choices in the first place and developing the self-awareness and emotional skills necessary to make better decisions going forward. This internal work has been just as important as my external efforts to combat educational crimes, because it has given me the psychological foundation necessary to maintain my commitment to legitimate activities, even when faced with temptations or pressures that might otherwise lead me back toward criminal involvement. The process is ongoing. I continue to work with mental health professionals and participate in support groups for former criminals, because I understand that the risk of moral relapse is always present and that maintaining my ethical compass requires constant vigilance and self-reflection. The broader implications of my case extend beyond organized crime and educational regulation into fundamental questions about professional responsibility, institutional ethics, and the role of individual conscience in complex organizational settings. The ease with which I was able to corrupt legitimate educational institutions and use their resources for criminal purposes reveals serious weaknesses in the ethical frameworks and oversight mechanisms that are supposed to prevent such exploitation. Many of the universities, education boards, and regulatory agencies that unknowingly facilitated the criminal recruitment operations had compliance programs and ethical guidelines that looked impressive on paper but failed to detect or prevent sophisticated criminal infiltration in practice. This disconnect between formal policies and actual effectiveness has become a major focus of my current work, as I help organizations develop more robust systems for identifying and addressing ethical risks before they become criminal liabilities. The key insight from my experience is that criminal organizations succeed not by overwhelming legitimate institutions with force, but by exploiting their weaknesses and blind spots, the gaps between departments that don't communicate effectively, the performance incentives that reward results without asking too many questions about methods, the cultural norms that discourage whistleblowing or challenges to authority. Addressing these vulnerabilities requires more than just better policies and procedures. It requires fundamental changes in organizational culture that prioritize ethical behavior over short-term profits and create safe channels for employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. I work with educational institutions to develop training programs that help faculty and administrators recognize the warning signs of criminal infiltration and understand their ethical obligations when faced with suspicious activities. I also assist in creating whistleblower protection programs that provide real security for individuals who come forward with evidence of wrongdoing, because my experience has shown that insider cooperation is often the only way to detect and prevent sophisticated criminal schemes. These efforts are part of a broader movement toward greater institutional accountability and transparency that has gained momentum in response to high-profile cases of educational corruption and abuse around the world. The international dimension of modern educational crimes has made my experience increasingly relevant to law enforcement agencies and policymakers around the world who are struggling to combat criminal organizations that operate across multiple jurisdictions and exploit differences in educational regulations and oversight frameworks. The recruitment network case demonstrated how criminal organizations use legitimate educational institutions and academic professionals in dozens of countries to facilitate their operations, creating a complex web of corruption that can only be unraveled through unprecedented levels of international cooperation and information sharing. My testimony in courts around the world has helped to establish legal precedents for prosecuting transnational educational crimes, and has provided practical insights into how criminal organizations adapt their methods to exploit specific vulnerabilities in different national education systems. This intelligence has been used to develop new international protocols for sharing educational intelligence, coordinating investigations across borders, and ensuring that criminals cannot escape prosecution simply by moving their recruitment operations from one country to another. The work involves not just law enforcement agencies, but also educational accreditation boards, regulatory authorities, and international organizations that are working to create more consistent and effective frameworks for combating educational corruption and abuse. One of the most important lessons from my case is that effective action against transnational educational crimes requires not just better laws and enforcement mechanisms, but also changes in the culture and practices of legitimate educational institutions that make them less vulnerable to criminal exploitation. This means implementing more rigorous credentialing procedures, developing better systems for detecting suspicious academic activities, and creating stronger incentives for compliance with educational ethics and regulatory standards. It also means addressing the competitive pressures and profit motives that sometimes lead legitimate educational providers to ask fewer questions than they should about the sources of funding or the purposes of academic programs. The goal is to create a global education system that is more transparent, more accountable, and more resistant to criminal infiltration, while still maintaining the innovation and accessibility that are essential for legitimate educational advancement. The personal relationships I have been able to build in my new life have been shaped by the constant tension between my desire for genuine human connection and the security requirements that prevent me from revealing my true identity and academic background. Learning to form meaningful friendships and romantic relationships while maintaining an elaborate cover story has required me to develop new skills in emotional compartmentalization and selective honesty that I never needed during my previous life as a professor. I have had to learn to be authentic about my current thoughts, feelings, and values while being completely deceptive about my professional history and the experiences that shaped those values. This psychological balancing act is exhausting and sometimes leads to feelings of isolation, even when I am surrounded by people who care about me. The relationships I have formed are real and meaningful, but they are also built on a foundation of necessary deception that creates barriers to the kind of deep intimacy that comes from sharing your complete self with another person. I have found ways to work around these limitations by focusing on present moment connections and shared activities, rather than dwelling on past experiences, and by being as honest as possible about my current beliefs and aspirations, even when I cannot explain how I developed them. Some of my closest relationships are with other individuals in witness protection or similar situations, people who understand the challenges of building a new identity while carrying the weight of a hidden past. These connections have been invaluable for my psychological well-being, providing a sense of community and understanding that would be impossible to find among people who have never faced similar challenges. I have also found meaning in mentoring young educational professionals who are just beginning their careers, helping them understand the ethical dimensions of academic work and the importance of maintaining their integrity even when faced with pressures or temptations that might lead them toward questionable activities. While I cannot share the specific details of my own experience, I can use the wisdom I have gained to help others avoid the mistakes I made and build careers that serve legitimate educational purposes rather than criminal enterprises. 15 years after I first began recruiting Japan's elite students for the Yakuza, and for years after my escape from the criminal recruitment network, I can reflect on the journey with a perspective that encompasses both the enormous personal costs and the significant positive impact that my decision to cooperate with law enforcement has had on the global fight against educational corruption and organized crime. The life I have built in witness protection is comfortable and meaningful, but it will never fully compensate for the relationships, professional identity, and sense of purpose that I sacrificed when I chose to expose the criminal organization that had corrupted my academic career and consumed my soul. The loneliness and isolation are permanent features of my existence, prices I will continue to pay for the rest of my life in exchange for the knowledge that I helped to prevent countless future victims from suffering at the hands of sophisticated criminal recruitment networks. But I have also found unexpected sources of satisfaction and purpose in my work as a consultant and educator, using my unique expertise to help others understand and combat the educational crimes that continue to plague academic systems around the world. The educational professionals I mentor, the law enforcement officers I train, and the potential defectors I counsel all represent opportunities to multiply the positive impact of my decision to come forward, creating ripple effects that extend far beyond the specific prosecutions that resulted from my testimony. Perhaps most importantly, I have learned that redemption is not a destination but a continuous process of choosing to use whatever knowledge and capabilities you possess in service of education rather than exploitation, of justice rather than criminal enterprise. This understanding has given me a framework for living with my past while working toward a future that serves the greater good, even when that work must be conducted under an assumed identity in a foreign country far from everything I once called home. The story I have shared with you today is not just about organized crime or educational corruption, but about the fundamental human capacity for change and the possibility of finding meaning and purpose even in the most difficult circumstances. If my experience can help even one educational professional recognize the warning signs of criminal recruitment, resist the temptations of easy money, or find the courage to come forward with evidence of educational wrongdoing, then the sacrifices I have made will have been worthwhile. If this story has resonated with you, if it has made you think about the ethical challenges that educational professionals face in today's complex world, then I ask you to take action that could help prevent others from making the same mistakes I made and protect the integrity of educational institutions that society depends on for knowledge and progress. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this need to reach young academics and educational professionals who may be vulnerable to recruitment by criminal organizations that disguise themselves as legitimate academic opportunities. Give this video a like if you believe that people can change, that redemption is possible even for those who have been complicit in serious crimes, and that sharing difficult truths about educational corruption can serve a greater purpose than protecting comfortable illusions about academic systems. But most importantly, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts about the ethical challenges that educational professionals face, the warning signs that might indicate criminal infiltration of academic institutions, and the support systems that could help educators resist or escape from criminal organizations. Your voice matters in this conversation, because the fight against educational corruption requires not just law enforcement action, but also professional awareness and individual courage to recognize and report suspicious academic activities. Share this story with others who work in education or any field where they might encounter academic organizations that operate with unusual secrecy, demand unquestioning loyalty, or ask them to compromise their professional ethics for financial gain. Help create a culture where asking questions about the purposes of academic programs and the sources of educational funding is seen as professional responsibility rather than unwelcome skepticism. Together, we can build a more transparent and accountable education system that serves legitimate learning purposes rather than criminal enterprises, where young academics understand both the temptations they may face and the resources available to help them make ethical choices, even under pressure. The recruitment network I helped to build and ultimately destroy was sustained by the silence and complicity of countless educational professionals who chose not to ask difficult questions or challenge suspicious academic activities. By sharing this story and encouraging others to speak up when they encounter potential educational wrongdoing, we can ensure that future criminal organizations will find it much harder to exploit academic institutions and corrupt honest educational professionals. Make your voice part of the solution to protecting the sacred trust between educators and those who seek knowledge.